Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the United States. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1852, when the first accounts of strange echoes began to surface in the marshlands west of Charleston County, South Carolina. Local hunters would return from expeditions with stories of voices calling out in unison, always at dusk, always in the same haunting cadence that seemed to rise from the brackish waters. The voices sounded like children, they would say, but with a hollowness that made their skin crawl. For years, these stories were dismissed as the product of isolation and exhaustion, tales spun by men who spent too much days alone in the unforgiving wilderness. If you're enjoying the story and feel like helping the channel with any amount, please support us by clicking the thanks button and donating whatever you wish. This really helps the channel keep posting new stories. That changed when a land surveyor named Thomas Blackwood discovered what appeared to be makeshift shelters built among the cypress knees deep in the Congaree swamp. According to county records dated April 12, 1854, Blackwood reported finding crude but ingenious structures fashioned from mud, reeds, and Spanish moss, small enough only to accommodate children or persons of diminutive stature. What troubled authorities wasn't just the discovery itself, but Blackwood's insistence that the structures appeared recently inhabited. The Tillman plantation, one of the largest in the region, stretched for over 800 acres along the edge of the swamplands. Census records from 1850 show that Jacob Tillman owned 73 enslaved persons, among them a set of twins born in 1837. According to the plantation's ledger, recovered during a courthouse renovation in 1961, these twins were simply listed as male property, matching, acquired from the Savannah auction, cost $400 for the pair. No names were recorded. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the level of documentation that survived, coupled with the systematic erasure of identity that was standard practice on plantations throughout the South. These twins existed only as property on paper, their humanity reduced to a financial transaction, yet their presence would eventually cast a long shadow over the entire Tillman lineage. By all accounts, Jacob Tillman ran his plantation with ruthless efficiency. Local newspapers from the period describe him as a man of considerable standing and exemplary Christian values, though these characterizations came exclusively from publications known to defend the institution of slavery. A different picture emerges from the journal of Eliza Montgomery, wife of a neighboring plantation owner, who wrote in her private correspondence, "The methods employed on the Tillman property are spoken of in hushed tones, even among those accustomed to the necessities of maintaining order. There are sounds that carry across the fields at night that I dare not describe, even in this private account. The twins worked in the cotton fields from the age of 6, according to work assignment logs. What distinguished them, based on overseer records, was their uncanny ability to communicate without speaking, a trait that made the overseer, a man named Richard Barrett, deeply uncomfortable. In his quarterly report to Tillman from the summer of 1848, Barrett wrote, "The matched boys continue to perform adequately, though their silent communications cause discomfort among the other hands. When separated, their work suffers considerably. I recommend keeping them assigned to the same field despite my personal reservations about their influence." The Congaree swamp that bordered the western edge of the Tillman plantation was considered impassable by most, a labyrinth of waterways, quicksand, and dense vegetation that stretched for miles. Local indigenous knowledge held that there were hidden pathways through the swamp, but this information was closely guarded. What we know from archaeological studies conducted in the 1950s is that there were indeed seasonal paths that could be navigated by those with intimate knowledge of the landscape. On the night of July 26, 1850, during a violent thunderstorm that local newspapers described as a deluge of biblical proportions, something happened on the Tillman plantation that would never be officially documented. According to kitchen house gossip recorded years later by a former cook who had been interviewed by a folklore collector from Charleston in 1878, the twins had been caught attempting to teach younger children to read, an offense that typically resulted in severe punishment. What followed has been pieced together from fragments. An entry in the plantation punishment log simply notes discipline administered to matching male property for seditious activities. The medical ledger, kept by the local doctor who serviced 3 plantations in the area, recorded a visit to the Tillman property the following day, but contains only the cryptic note, advised against further application of salt to open tissues. Patient unlikely to survive regardless. That night, during the peak of the storm, the twins disappeared. The official narrative, as recorded in a notice placed in the Charleston Mercury on August 2, 1850, described them as runaways, dangerous and likely injured. A reward of $50 was offered for their return. What's striking about this notice is that it marked the first time the twins were given names in any official capacity: Solomon and Samuel. Whether these were names they had chosen for themselves or labels assigned by the Tillman family remains unknown. The standard procedure for tracking escaped slaves involved the use of dogs and hired slave catchers who knew the surrounding territories. According to expense records from the Tillman plantation, 3 separate tracking parties were organized over the course of August 1850. The first 2 returned empty-handed. The third did not return at all. The disappearance of the 3rd tracking party, led by an experienced slave catcher named Jeremiah Holt and 2 of his associates, prompted the formation of a larger search group that included men from neighboring plantations. This escalation reflected not just the loss of property, but a growing unease about what exactly was happening in the swamp. According to a letter sent by Jacob Tillman to the county sheriff, dated September 10, 1850, the situation has grown beyond the matter of 2 escaped males and now involves the disappearance of 3 white men of good standing. I request official intervention, as this matter now concerns public safety rather than merely private property. The official search party, consisting of 12 armed men, ventured into the swamp on September 15th. They returned 3 days later with a strange account that was documented in the sheriff's official report, now preserved in the South Carolina State Archives. According to Sheriff William Holcomb, the expedition encountered evidence of human habitation deep within the swampland, in areas previously considered uninhabitable. Structures fashioned from natural materials were discovered, along with what appeared to be a system of elevated pathways constructed across the boggy terrain. Most disturbing was the discovery of items belonging to Mr. Holt and his associates, arranged in what can only be described as a deliberate display. The items included their weapons, boots, and personal effects, yet no trace of the men themselves was found. The dogs became unusually agitated in this area and refused to advance further. What happened next set in motion a chain of events that would eventually give rise to the legend of the Cotton Field Ghosts. Jacob Tillman, increasingly obsessed with the twins' escape and the subsequent disappearances, organized his own expedition into the swamp, bringing with him his oldest son, Jacob Jr., and 4 of his most trusted hands. They departed on October 3, 1850. Equipped with supplies for a week-long search, only Jacob Jr. returned, emerging from the swamp on October 10th, alone and in a state that the family physician described as acute nervous exhaustion. He was found by a fishing party along the swamp's eastern edge, his clothes torn and body covered in mud. According to the doctor's notes, the young man was unable or unwilling to provide a coherent account of the expedition's fate. He would say only that his father and the others were claimed by the swamp. For 3 months following his return, Jacob Jr. remained largely confined to his room in the family house, refusing visitors and speaking only to his mother and the house servants. During this period, according to household staff accounts collected years later, he insisted that the windows remain shuttered at all times and would become severely agitated at the sound of distant voices, particularly around dusk. In January 1851, Jacob Jr. finally provided a written statement to local authorities regarding the fate of his father and the others. This document, preserved in county records, is remarkable for its clinical detachment. The search party separated on the 4th day to cover more ground. I remained with my father and one other man. We heard what sounded like a child calling for help, and followed the voice deeper into the swamp. The terrain became increasingly difficult to navigate. At some point, I became separated from the others. Despite my calls, I received no response. After attempting to locate them for several hours, I was forced to make my way out alone, which took approximately 3 days due to disorientation. What makes this account particularly suspect is that it contradicts statements made by house servants who claimed to have overheard Jacob Jr. during what appeared to be nightmares in the weeks following his return. According to these accounts, he would call out about eyes watching from the water and voices that speak without sound. Most disturbing was his repeated reference to the twins standing together like one person. By the spring of 1851, the Tillman plantation had fallen into a state of noticeable decline. With Jacob Sr. presumed dead, ownership passed to his son, who showed little interest in managing the property. Neighbors reported that fields remained untended and discipline grew lax. According to local gossip, recorded in various personal diaries from the period, the younger Tillman spent increasing amounts of time drinking and was frequently seen at the edge of the property, staring into the swamp. In June of that year, a series of unusual events began that would cement the legend of the twins in local folklore. Workers in the fields farthest from the main house began reporting sightings of 2 identical figures, watching from the tree line at the swamp's edge. These sightings always occurred at dusk, and always on days when Jacob Jr. was away from the property. According to testimonies collected by a journalist from the Charleston Courier who visited the plantation in July 1851, at least 7 different workers claimed to have seen 2 young men standing perfectly still and perfectly identical, wearing clothes made from swamp materials, their eyes reflecting light like those of swamp creatures. The journalist, a man named Edward Pemberton, initially approached these accounts with skepticism, attributing them to superstition and the general atmosphere of unease that had settled over the plantation. However, in his published article, which appeared on July 28, 1851, Pemberton wrote, "While this correspondent maintains a rational explanation exists for the phenomena reported on the Tillman property, I must in good conscience report that during my evening interview with the current Mr. Tillman, I myself observed what appeared to be 2 silhouettes at the edge of the swamp. When I directed my host's attention to this sight, he became immediately distressed and ordered the shutters closed and additional lamps lit, refusing to speak further on the matter." By the fall of 1851, the Tillman plantation had become a place of whispered rumors and growing fear. Workers began requesting transfers to other properties, something almost unheard of in the rigid plantation system. More troubling were the disappearances. 3 field hands vanished over the course of 2 months. In each case, the person had been assigned to work in the westernmost fields adjacent to the swamp. In each case, they were last seen as dusk approached. Jacob Tillman Jr.'s response to these disappearances was documented in a letter to the county sheriff dated November 12, 1851. I request that no official search be conducted for the missing property. The swamp has claimed them as it has claimed others. Further intrusion will only result in additional losses. This fatalistic attitude, combined with his increasingly erratic behavior, contributed to a sense that the Tillman plantation was somehow cursed. By December, production had fallen so significantly that creditors began expressing concern. According to bank records from Charleston, loans taken out against future harvests went unpaid, and by early 1852, the bank was considering foreclosure. The situation came to a head on the night of February 15, 1852. According to accounts from the house servants, Jacob Jr. spent that evening in his study, drinking heavily and writing what would later be described as a confession. Around midnight, he ordered a horse saddled and rode toward the swamp, carrying only a lantern and the papers he had been writing. He instructed the stable hand not to expect his return. The confession, which was discovered the following day on his desk, has been preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archives. Parts of it were damaged by what appears to be water or some other liquid, but the legible portions provide a disturbing glimpse into the events of the previous year. What we did to those boys over the years was beyond the common cruelties of our institution. My father took a particular interest in breaking what he called their unnatural bond. They were separated, starved, subjected to trials that I cannot commit to paper even now. The night they escaped, they had been illegible section and were not expected to survive until morning. The document goes on to describe the expedition into the swamp. We found their settlement on the 6th day. It was unlike anything I had seen. Structures built above the water on stilts, connected by pathways visible only to those who knew where to look. The twins had created something impossible. They were not alone. We counted at least 12 others, all previously from our property, all reported as runaways or presumed dead. They had built a community in a place we thought uninhabitable. The most disturbing passage comes near the end. When they took my father, he was still alive. The twins approached him together, moving as one person, their expressions identical. They did not speak. They never spoke. But somehow, everyone knew what was to be done. I was spared only to deliver a message, though no words were ever spoken. The message was clear. The swamp is now their plantation, and we are not welcome. The final paragraph reads, I return to them tonight of my own accord. The watching has become unbearable. They stand at the edge of the property every evening now, visible only to me. Their eyes reflect the light like those of swamp creatures. They are waiting for me to join my father. Jacob Tillman Jr. was never seen again. In the aftermath, the Tillman plantation was sold at auction to cover outstanding debts. The new owner, a man named Harrison Miller from Virginia, arrived in April 1852 with ambitious plans to restore the property to productivity. According to his business correspondence, preserved by his descendants and donated to the University of South Carolina in 1958, Miller was aware of the property's troubled history, but dismissed the stories as superstitious nonsense spread by lazy and ignorant workers. Miller's first action was to drain a portion of the swampland to expand the cultivatable acreage. Work began in May 1852 and immediately encountered problems. Equipment broke down frequently, workers reported unusual illnesses, and on 3 separate occasions, the drainage ditches that had been dug during the day were found filled in the following morning. By June, Miller's correspondence had taken on a different tone. There is something unusual about this place, particularly as it relates to the swampland. The locals refuse to work near it, especially in the late afternoon hours. I've had to bring in workers from elsewhere at considerable expense, and even they grow reluctant after a few days. Last week, our surveyor reported seeing two identical young men watching from the tree line. When approached, they reportedly retreated into the water and disappeared. The surveyor resigned that same day. In July 1852, Miller made what would prove to be a fatal decision. Frustrated by the ongoing resistance to developing the swampland, he organized a large-scale expedition to locate and destroy what he called the hidden settlement that harbors fugitives and fosters superstition. 20 armed men ventured into the swamp on July 20th. They carried enough supplies for a week and were under instructions to methodically search every possible location where people might be living. Only 3 returned, emerging separately over the course of 3 days. Each told a similar story. The group had become separated in the swamp despite their best efforts to stay together. They reported hearing their companions calling for help, only to find no one when they reached the apparent source of the cries. The most disturbing account came from Miller's foreman, who claimed to have glimpsed what he described as a thriving village built on stilts above the water, inhabited by at least 30 souls, with 2 identical young men appearing to direct the others without speaking a word. Harrison Miller himself was among those who never returned. His body was discovered 3 weeks later at the edge of the property, half submerged in a drainage ditch that had been dug under his orders. The county coroner listed the cause of death as drowning, though noted that the body showed unusual signs of prolonged immersion despite being found in shallow water. With Miller's death, the property once again changed hands. This time, however, no single buyer could be found willing to take on what was now openly referred to as the haunted plantation. The land was divided and sold in parcels, with the portion bordering the swamp remaining unclaimed and eventually reverting to the state. Throughout the remainder of the 1850s, the legend of the twins grew throughout the region. They became known as the Cottonfield Ghosts, a name that persisted despite the fact that all accounts described them as living, breathing people. What made them ghost-like in the public imagination was their ability to appear and disappear, their identical nature, and the impossibility of their survival in an environment considered uninhabitable. Reported sightings continued for years, always following the same pattern. 2 identical young men, observed at dusk, standing perfectly still at the boundary between cultivated land and wilderness. Those who claimed to have seen them up close described their eyes as reflecting light like those of alligators, and their skin as having taken on the texture of the swamp itself. In 1856, a professor of natural history from the College of Charleston, named James Whittaker, became interested in the case. Skeptical of the supernatural elements, but intrigued by the possibility that a community of escaped slaves had indeed established a settlement in the swamp, Whittaker began collecting testimonies and examining public records related to the Tillman plantation. His research, published in 1858 as An Investigation of Reported Phenomena in the Congaree Swamp, represents one of the first attempts at a scientific explanation for the events. Whittaker proposed that the twins had indeed escaped into the swamp, and, possessing unusual intelligence and perhaps knowledge gained from local indigenous people, had managed to establish a sustainable living situation in this hostile environment. He suggested that their reported ability to communicate without speaking was likely a form of sign language developed during their years in captivity, when silence was often necessary for survival. As for their ghostly appearances at the edge of the swamp, Whittaker proposed that these were deliberate acts of psychological warfare against their former oppressors. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of Whittaker's research was his discovery that disappearances and sightings followed a pattern corresponding to attempts to develop or encroach upon the swampland. In periods when neighboring properties respected the boundary of the swamp, incidents were rare. When development was attempted, sightings and disappearances increased dramatically. The final documented sighting of the twins came in August 1860, a decade after their escape. A land surveying party, working on behalf of a railroad company, considering a route through the region, reported encountering two identical men of approximately 35 years of age, dressed in clothing fashioned from natural materials, standing in the center of the path approximately half a mile into the swampland. According to the surveyor's report, preserved in railroad company records, the men made no sound but gestured in a way that clearly indicated we should retreat. When our guide attempted to continue forward, the pair made a motion toward the water, at which point the guide observed something that caused him to back away immediately. He refused to elaborate on what he had seen, but insisted we leave the area at once. Upon our departure, we observed the two men watching until we were out of sight. The railroad ultimately chose a different route. The Civil War and subsequent societal changes shifted attention away from the legend of the Swamp Twins. The former Tillman plantation lands were further subdivided, and many of the individuals who had direct knowledge of the events died or moved away. By the 1880s, the story had largely transformed from recent history to local folklore. In 1959, a doctoral student in anthropology from the University of South Carolina named Margaret Hollis became interested in the legend while researching communities of escaped slaves in the South. Hollis spent 3 years collecting oral histories from descendants of people who had lived in the area during the 1850s. Her dissertation, completed in 1962 but never published, contains transcripts of these interviews, including several from elderly individuals who claimed their grandparents or great-grandparents had been among those who escaped to join the swamp community. According to these accounts, the twins, whose actual names were not Solomon and Samuel but Adolfo and Kwame, reflecting their West African heritage, had indeed established a settlement deep within the Congaree swamp. The community supposedly survived for decades, gradually integrating with other marginalized groups in the area following the Civil War. What made Hollis's research particularly controversial was her claim, based on these oral histories, that the twins had established a complex system of governance based on consensus rather than hierarchy, and that their apparently supernatural abilities were actually the result of an elaborate system of signals and environmental knowledge. Hollis attempted to locate the site of the settlement based on descriptions provided in these oral histories, but the constantly changing nature of the swamp environment made this impossible. In her field notes from June 1961, she wrote, "Local guides remain reluctant to venture deeply into certain areas of the swamp, particularly as evening approaches. When pressed, they simply say that some places still belong to the twins and their people, even after all these years." The most tantalizing piece of evidence uncovered by Hollis came in the form of a photograph taken in 1891. Discovered in the personal collection of a family that had owned property neighboring the former Tillman plantation. The photograph shows a group of men standing in front of a rural church. At the edge of the group are two elderly black men who appear identical, their posture straight despite their apparent age, their expressions unreadable. The notation on the back of the photograph identifies the church, but not the individuals pictured. Hollis's dissertation advisor ultimately advised her to focus on more verifiable aspects of maroon communities in the South, and her research into the twins was relegated to an appendix. Shortly after completing her dissertation, Hollis accepted a teaching position at a university in California and never returned to the research. Her papers, including her field notes and copies of the photograph, were donated to the University of South Carolina archives following her death in 1968. Today, the Congaree Swamp is part of a national park. Rangers occasionally report that visitors ask about the twin ghosts, though the story has largely faded from popular knowledge. What remains is a protected wilderness that continues to guard its secrets, and perhaps somewhere deep within, the legacy of two brothers who refused to be property and created something that, to those who had enslaved them, seemed impossible, a place of freedom. The true horror of this story lies not in supernatural elements, but in the very real system that treated human beings as property, that separated families, that responded to the quest for freedom with violence. It lies in the knowledge that for every documented case like that of the twins, there were thousands of others whose names and stories were systematically erased from history. The sounds that travelers sometimes report hearing in the Congaree as dusk approaches, voices calling in unison, then falling silent when approached, are attributed to birds or the wind moving through the cypress trees. Rangers assure visitors that the trails are safe and well maintained, but some local guides still refuse to enter certain areas as the light begins to fade. When asked why, they often give practical reasons: difficulty navigating in low light, the presence of wildlife that becomes more active at dusk. Only rarely will someone admit to the real reason: a persistent belief that some parts of the swamp still belong to those who claimed it as their own, who transformed a place of exile into a place of freedom, and who still stand watch at the boundary between their world and ours. In 1966, a historian researching disappeared settlements in the region reported a strange experience while camping near the former boundary of the Tillman plantation. In his field notes, he wrote, "As dusk fell, I observed what appeared to be two figures standing at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still and seemingly identical. When I called out, they retreated into the tree line. I followed, but found no trace. What struck me most was not fear, but a profound sense that I was the intruder, that I had ventured uninvited into a place where others had rightful claim. I packed my equipment that night and left at first light. Some histories, perhaps, are not meant to be documented by those who inherit the legacy of the oppressors. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the story of the twins comes from a poem written by an anonymous author in 1870, discovered in a collection of local folklore compiled by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s. Two brothers born as one, divided by force, but never truly parted, found in water and darkness what was denied in light and land. They speak now without voices, watch without being seen, standing guard at the border between what was taken and what was claimed. Listen at dusk for their silence. It says more than our histories ever could." The research into the twins' legacy took an unexpected turn in 1963, when a hydrological survey of the Congaree swamp revealed unusual patterns in the water flow that suggested artificial modifications to the natural environment. According to the survey report filed with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, certain channels appear to have been deliberately altered to create areas of habitable dry land where none should naturally exist. These modifications show considerable ingenuity and an intimate understanding of swamp hydrology. Most striking is the fact that these alterations appear to have been maintained over time, suggesting continuous human intervention spanning decades. This discovery prompted a small archaeological expedition in the spring of 1964, led by Dr. Robert Thornton from the University of North Carolina. The expedition's stated purpose was to document evidence of historical habitation within the swamp, with a particular focus on potential maroon communities, settlements of escaped slaves who created independent societies in remote areas. According to the expedition's official report, preserved in the university archives, evidence of long-term human habitation was discovered approximately 3 miles into the swampland from the former Tillman property line. Artifacts recovered include modified tools, pottery fragments consistent with 19th century manufacture but showing unique adaptations to the swamp environment, and the remnants of what appear to be elevated structural supports. The most significant find, however, was discovered when the team began excavating what appeared to be a midden, a historical trash deposit. Among the discarded items were several personal effects that could be directly linked to the Tillman plantation, including a pocket watch with the initials JT engraved on the case, consistent with Jacob Tillman Sr. More disturbing was the discovery of what Dr. Thornton described as human remains, showing evidence of deliberate interment according to what appears to be a specific ritual pattern. The remains of 6 individuals were uncovered, all adult males, positioned in a circular arrangement around a central point. Further analysis of these remains, conducted at the university laboratory, indicated that all 6 had died of different causes, but all had been subjected to post-mortem practices that the report described only as consistent with certain West African funerary customs designed to prevent the spirit's return. The report noted that 3 of the individuals showed evidence of having been plantation owners or overseers, based on clothing fragments and personal items buried with them. According to notes in Dr. Thornton's field journal, which were not included in the official report, but were later found among his personal papers after his death in 1967, the arrangement of these burials suggests not merely disposal of bodies, but a deliberate ritual meant to establish boundaries. Local folklore specialists have suggested this pattern is consistent with traditional practices intended to create a spiritual barrier around a protected area. What's most unsettling is the evidence that these rituals continued well into the 1880s, long after the initial escape of the twins and the disappearance of Jacob Tillman. The expedition was scheduled to continue for another week, venturing deeper into the swamp toward what satellite imagery suggested might be the main settlement area. However, on April 27, 1964, a severe storm hit the region, flooding much of the swamp and forcing the team to evacuate. According to Dr. Thornton's records, during the evacuation, 2 team members became briefly separated from the main group. When they rejoined the others, they reported having seen 2 elderly men, identical in appearance, observing us from an elevated platform approximately 50 yards away. By the time the rest of the team looked in that direction, there was no one visible. The planned return to the site never materialized. University records indicate that funding for the project was unexpectedly cut the following month, with a note from the department chair stating that the academic value of the project does not justify the considerable risks involved in conducting research in such a hazardous environment. Dr. Thornton's subsequent appeals for renewed funding were denied, and he eventually shifted his research focus to coastal archaeological sites. However, in a private letter to a colleague, dated December 18, 1965, Thornton wrote, "The real reason for the termination of the Congaree project had nothing to do with academic value or physical risk. Shortly after our return, I was visited by 2 representatives from a federal agency who expressed national security concerns about our findings. They were particularly interested in our photographic documentation of the modified waterways and structural foundations. All our materials were confiscated under the pretense of historical preservation, though I was assured copies would be returned to me. They never were. When I inquired further, I was informed that the area we had been investigating was now restricted for environmental conservation purposes. The more I consider what we found, and what we might have found had we continued, the more I'm convinced that there is something in that swamp that certain powers do not want documented." In 1966, an article appeared in a small local newspaper serving the communities around the Congaree region. The article, written by a junior reporter named Michael Denton, described a pattern of unusual occurrences in the areas bordering the swamp. According to Denton's investigation, there had been 17 incidents over the previous decade in which individuals attempting to conduct unauthorized development or resource extraction in protected areas of the swamp had experienced what he termed targeted misfortunes. These ranged from equipment failures to personal accidents, with all affected individuals reporting having seen two identical figures watching from a distance shortly before the incidents occurred. Most telling was Denton's interview with a former ranger from the recently established Congaree Wildlife Conservation Area, who spoke on condition of anonymity. "There are parts of that swamp we're instructed not to patrol, especially after about 4 in the afternoon. The official reason is dangerous terrain, but everyone knows the real story. Something's out there that doesn't want to be found, and the higher-ups have made the decision to respect that wish. I've seen them myself. 2 men always together, always watching. They never approach, never threaten. They just make their presence known when you're getting close to somewhere you shouldn't be." Denton's article might have reached a wider audience had the newspaper not abruptly closed the following month due to financial difficulties. Denton himself moved to Atlanta to pursue other journalistic opportunities, though colleagues noted his reluctance to discuss his final story from his time at the local paper. In 1968, during construction of a new highway that would pass within a mile of the former Tillman plantation land, workers reported a series of unusual equipment malfunctions. According to incident reports filed with the construction company, these malfunctions occurred primarily in the late afternoon and affected only the equipment being used closest to the swamp boundary. Multiple workers resigned over the course of the project, citing unsettling experiences that most refused to elaborate on. One worker, however, provided a detailed statement to his supervisor that was included in the project records. "We were finishing up for the day, around 5:30 in the afternoon, when I noticed 2 men standing at the edge of the clearing. They looked identical, same height, same build, same clothing. What struck me was how still they were. When I pointed them out to my coworker, he said we should pack up immediately. As we were loading our equipment, I kept glancing over at them. They never moved, just watched us. The next day, we found our excavator partially submerged in a sinkhole that hadn't been there the evening before. The project manager decided to shift the highway route another quarter-mile east after that. The highway was eventually completed in 1969, though records indicate that the final route diverged significantly from the original plan, adding considerable cost to the project. The official explanation cited unstable ground conditions as the reason for the change. Throughout the 1970s, as environmental protection became a greater national priority, the Congaree Swamp received increasing attention from conservation groups. Their efforts led to its designation as a national monument in 1976, protecting it from further development. What's notable in the congressional testimony supporting this designation is the absence of any mention of the historical human habitation of the area. The swamp was presented solely as a pristine natural environment, with no acknowledgement of its role as a refuge for escaped slaves, or the community that oral histories suggested had thrived there for decades. This omission did not go unnoticed by everyone. Dr. Elaine Johnson, a historian specializing in African American communities during the post-Civil War era, began researching the Congaree settlements in 1979. In her grant application to the National Endowment for the Humanities, she wrote, "There appears to be a systematic erasure of the human history of the Congaree Swamp, particularly as it relates to the community of formerly enslaved individuals who created an independent society there. This erasure serves to perpetuate the myth that such successful resistance to the slave system was impossible, when in fact we have substantial evidence that it not only occurred, but thrived for generations. Johnson's grant was approved, but her research faced constant obstacles. In her project notes from March 1980, she wrote, "Local informants who had previously expressed willingness to share family stories suddenly become reluctant when I arrive for scheduled interviews. Archives that had confirmed the availability of certain documents now claim they cannot be located. Most disturbing is the repeated warning I receive, always delivered obliquely, that some histories are better left unexplored." Despite these challenges, Johnson managed to compile significant evidence supporting the existence of what she termed the Swamp Nation, a self-governing community that had existed within the Congaree from approximately 1850 to the early 1900s. Her most compelling findings came from census records from 1870 and 1880, which showed unusual patterns in the reported population of certain rural areas bordering the swamp. According to her analysis, there is a statistical anomaly in which households on the swamp border report taking in distant relatives or elderly companions at a rate far exceeding the regional average. When these individuals are tracked through subsequent records, they often have no clear origin but are frequently described as formerly from the South Carolina interior, a vague designation that could well indicate the swamp communities. Johnson also uncovered evidence that the twins had not merely survived, but had become influential figures in the broader community. In church records from a small black congregation established in 1868 near the edge of the swamp, there are multiple references to the brothers who speak as one, who would occasionally attend services, but more often sent representatives from the interior settlement. These records include a notation from the pastor, dated 1873. "The brothers attended today for the wedding of young Sarah. As always, they spoke not a word during the service, but communicated their blessing in their own way. The bride seemed especially honored by their presence, as they rarely venture this far from their domain. They have aged visibly since last I saw them, yet they move with the same quiet strength. One cannot help but feel that they carry with them the very spirit of liberation that our people still strive toward." Johnson's research was never formally published. According to colleagues, she intended to compile her findings into a book, but the manuscript remained unfinished at the time of her death in 1984. The circumstances of her death, a single vehicle accident on a rural road near the Congaree, raised questions among some who knew her work. According to the police report, Johnson's car veered off the road and into a drainage ditch approximately 2 miles from the entrance to what was then the Congaree National Monument. The accident occurred at dusk, and there were no witnesses. Johnson's research materials, which should have been extensive, were never recovered. Her university office was found meticulously organized but empty of any notes or documentation related to the Congaree project. Her home similarly contained no relevant materials. A colleague who had been working closely with Johnson told a local reporter that just a week before her death, Johnson had mentioned making a breakthrough discovery that would change our understanding of how resistance to slavery could succeed. The nature of this discovery remains unknown. In 1989, during an unusually severe drought that caused water levels in the Congaree to drop significantly, a group of hikers ventured off the marked trails and discovered what appeared to be the remains of an elevated structure deep within the swamp. According to their report to park rangers, we found wooden posts extending from the dried mud, arranged in a pattern that clearly indicated human construction. What was most interesting was that these posts showed tool marks consistent with 19th century methods, yet the wood itself was remarkably preserved, suggesting some form of treatment that protected it from normal decay. Park officials investigated the site, but downplayed its significance, describing it as likely a hunter's blind or temporary shelter of relatively recent origin. No formal archaeological assessment was conducted, and within weeks, heavy rains had raised the water levels again, submerging the structure. When independent researchers attempted to locate the site later that year, they found that park maps had been revised, with the area in question now marked as a sensitive ecological zone with restricted access. Throughout the 1990s, as interest in African American history and the Underground Railroad grew, there were periodic attempts to investigate the legends surrounding the Congaree twins. These efforts consistently met with official resistance, justified on grounds of environmental protection, and unofficial obstacles in the form of local reluctance to discuss the topic. A pattern emerged in which those who pressed too persistently reported strange experiences: equipment malfunctions, disorientation in areas they knew well, and, most commonly, sightings of two identical figures observing them from a distance, particularly as daylight faded. In 1997, a graduate student named Thomas Williams, researching maroon communities for his doctoral dissertation, managed to interview several elderly residents from communities bordering the swamp. One interview, with a 93-year-old woman named Clara Jenkins, provided the most direct link yet to the original twins. According to the transcript of this interview, conducted on June 12, 1997, Williams: "Did your family ever mention people living in the swamp?" Jenkins: "My grandmother told me about the twins. She called them the Guardians. Said they were ancient even when she was a girl, but still stood straight and tall. Said they had escaped from a plantation when they were young men and made the swamp their kingdom." Williams: "Did she ever meet them?" Jenkins: "She said she did once. Said her father took her to a meeting place at the edge of the swamp just as the sun was setting. The twins were there, standing side by side. She said they never spoke a word that she could hear, but her father seemed to understand them. After that meeting, her family always left offerings at a certain cypress tree near the water's edge. Food, tools, seeds. By morning, the offerings would be gone." Williams: "When was this?" Jenkins: "Must have been around 1900, maybe a little before. My grandmother was just a child. She said the twins would be over 100 years old by then if they were the same men from the stories, but nobody questioned it. Some said they weren't the same men, but their sons or grandsons who carried on the watching. Others said it was always the same too, protected by the swamp itself." Williams: "Do you believe they're still there?" At this point, according to Williams's notes, Jenkins fell silent for nearly a minute before responding. Jenkins: "Young man, some questions are invitations. Be careful what you invite into your life. But I'll tell you this. My grandson works for the Park Service. 2 years ago, he was helping with a survey deep in the restricted area. It was getting toward evening, and he stayed behind to finish some measurements while the others headed back. He said he felt someone watching him, turned around, and saw 2 old men standing on what looked like a walkway above the water. Identical men. They made a gesture telling him to leave, and he did. Never told his supervisors, just me. Next day, that whole section was flooded, though there hadn't been any rain. Williams attempted to follow up on this account by contacting Jenkins' grandson, but his request was declined. His subsequent application for a research permit to access restricted areas of the Congaree was denied by park authorities, who cited ongoing sensitive ecological studies in those zones. In 2004, during the digitization of historical records at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, a technician discovered a previously uncatalogued collection of materials related to the Tillman plantation. Among these materials was a journal belonging to Elizabeth Tillman, wife of Jacob Tillman Sr., covering the period from 1848 to 1852. The journal had apparently been misfiled decades earlier within a collection of agricultural records, and thus escaped the attention of previous researchers. Elizabeth Tillman's journal provides a perspective on the events surrounding the twins' escape, that had not previously been documented. In an entry dated July 25, 1850, the day before the escape, she wrote, "Jay has gone too far this time. The matched boys were caught teaching letters to the little ones, and he has ordered a punishment that no Christian should witness, much less inflict. I spoke against it but was silenced as usual. The doctor has been summoned for tomorrow, though what medical attention could possibly suffice after such treatment, I cannot imagine. I pray for their souls and for Jay's, though I fear the latter is beyond redemption." Her entry from July 27th, the day after the escape, is equally revealing. "They are gone, and Jay is in a rage such as I have never witnessed. The storm provided cover for their flight. The storeroom was found pillaged, salt, tools, seeds taken. Jay insists they could not have gone far in their condition, but I am not so certain. There has always been something about those two that defied natural explanation, the way they worked in perfect harmony, without a word spoken between them, the way they seemed to know things before they happened. The other servants give them a wide berth, some out of fear, others out of respect. I cannot help but think their disappearance is God's judgment upon this house." Subsequent entries track the mounting obsession of her husband with finding the twins and the deterioration of the plantation's fortunes. In an entry dated October 2nd, 1850, she wrote, "Jay leaves tomorrow to search the swamp himself. I have begged him to abandon this pursuit, but his pride will not allow it. He speaks of the twins as if they have personally betrayed him, as if they were not driven to desperate measures by his own cruelty. Something has changed in him since their escape. He stands at the edge of the property in the evenings, staring into the swamp, as if expecting to see something emerge. Last night he claimed he saw them watching from the tree line, though Barrett saw nothing when sent to investigate." Her final entry regarding her husband, dated October 11th, 1850, reads, "Jacob Jr. returned alone today in a state beyond description. He will say nothing of his father's fate except that the swamp has claimed him. The others who went with them are also lost. I find myself unable to mourn as a wife should. Whatever befell Jay, in that place I cannot help but feel it was the natural consequence of a life built on others' suffering. The twins have exacted a justice that the law would never provide." The discovery of Elizabeth Tillman's journal provided new insight into the climate of fear that had surrounded the twins even before their escape, suggesting that their unusual bond and apparent ability to communicate without speaking had marked them as different in the eyes of both the enslaved community and their enslavers. Most significantly, the journal confirmed elements of the story that had previously been dismissed as folklore, particularly the twins' literacy and their role in teaching others, a dangerous act of resistance in a system that denied enslaved people education. The journal was made available to researchers in 2005, though access required special permission and on-site viewing only. Strangely, within months of its discovery, the journal was reclassified as being in too fragile a condition for regular consultation and was removed from public access pending conservation treatment. Requests to view digital scans were similarly denied on technical grounds. As of 2007, the journal was listed in the archives catalogue as temporarily unavailable, a status that apparently remains unchanged to this day. In 2010, during the planning phase for an expansion of the visitor facilities at what was now Congaree National Park, an environmental impact assessment revealed another potential archaeological site deep within a previously unstudied section of the swamp. According to the preliminary report, ground-penetrating radar indicated extensive subsurface structures consistent with human habitation, including what appear to be the foundations of approximately 20 distinct buildings arranged in a village-like pattern. The structures were estimated to date from the mid-19th to early 20th centuries. Rather than proceeding with a full archaeological investigation, however, the Park Service abruptly modified the expansion plans to avoid any disturbance to the area in question. The official explanation cited critical habitat for endangered species as the reason for the change, though the environmental assessment had not identified any such habitat in its initial findings. A Freedom of Information Act request, filed in 2011 by a historical preservation group seeking the full data from the radar survey, was denied on grounds of national security concerns related to critical infrastructure protection. This unusual justification prompted speculation among researchers and local historians that the site might contain something beyond historical significance, perhaps evidence that could still have legal or political implications regarding the treatment of escaped slaves and their descendants. In 2013, a local folklore researcher named David Monroe began systematically collecting contemporary accounts of unusual experiences in and around the Congaree. Over a 3-year period, he documented 63 separate incidents involving sightings of 2 identical figures observed at dusk within the park boundaries or along its edges. The sightings followed a consistent pattern. The figures were always described as elderly but straight-backed, identical in every detail, and watching but not threatening. In every case, those who reported these sightings described an overwhelming sense that they should leave the area immediately, a suggestion they invariably followed. Monroe attempted to identify patterns in where these sightings occurred, creating a map that suggested a roughly circular boundary within the park. Inside this boundary, park rangers rarely patrolled, and official trails either skirted the edge or were consistently reported as being temporarily closed for maintenance. When Monroe presented his findings to park officials in 2016, requesting permission to conduct research within this zone, his application was denied. The official response stated only that the area in question was subject to unpredictable flooding and therefore unsafe for public access. Undeterred, Monroe continued his research from the periphery. In an article published in a regional historical journal in 2017, he proposed that the twins had not merely escaped into the swamp, but had established a parallel society that existed alongside but separate from the surrounding communities. Drawing on census anomalies, oral histories, and the scattered archaeological evidence that had emerged over the decades, he suggested that this community had developed its own governance, agricultural practices, and social structures adapted to the unique environment of the swamp. Most controversially, Monroe proposed that this community might still exist in some form. He pointed to the consistent reports of identical watchers, the protected status of certain areas within the park, and the reluctance of officials to investigate potential archaeological sites as evidence of what he termed an unacknowledged accommodation, an unofficial agreement to respect boundaries that dated back to the original twins. Monroe's article attracted little mainstream attention, but circulated widely among those interested in local history and folklore. In 2018, he was reportedly planning a book that would expand on his theories. However, in January 2019, Monroe announced that he was abandoning the project and moving to Oregon for health and personal reasons. Attempts by colleagues to contact him about his research were met with polite but firm refusals to discuss the topic further. One of Monroe's former research assistants, speaking anonymously to a local newspaper, claimed that shortly before abandoning the project, Monroe had ventured into the swamp alone, staying until after dusk, despite the park's closing hours. When he returned, according to this account, he was visibly shaken and immediately began making arrangements to leave the area. When asked what had happened, he would say only that he had received a message, and that some histories belong to those who lived them, not to those who wished to study them. Today, the Congaree National Park remains a protected wilderness, celebrated for its biodiversity and pristine ecosystem. Official materials make no mention of the twins or the community they allegedly established. Park rangers, when asked about the legends, typically offer a standardized response about the rich folklore of the region, while emphasizing that many such stories have been embellished over time. Yet, the stories persist. Hikers occasionally report strange experiences, particularly as daylight fades. The feeling of being watched, glimpses of figures that disappear when approached, paths that seem to shift and redirect them away from certain areas. Most dismiss these experiences as tricks of light and imagination in an environment known for its disorienting qualities. Others leave with a sense that they have brushed against something that exists at the boundary between history and legend. Perhaps the most telling aspect of the twins' legacy is not what has been documented, but what remains obscured. The systematic gaps in the historical record, the abrupt ends to promising research, the protected zones within an already protected wilderness, all suggest a story that continues to resist full disclosure. It is as if the twins, having escaped one form of bondage, now seek to escape another, the bondage of becoming mere history, to be studied, categorized, and ultimately dismissed. For those who have encountered what they believe to be the watchers of the swamp, the experience often leaves a lasting impression, not of fear, but of having briefly witnessed a different kind of freedom. As one recent visitor wrote in an online forum dedicated to unexplained experiences, "I was hiking near dusk, I know against park rules, when I saw them, two old men standing perfectly still about 50 yards away watching me. They were identical, dressed in simple clothes that somehow seemed both modern and timeless. I felt no threat from them, just an unmistakable message that I had strayed somewhere I shouldn't be. As I turned to leave, I glanced back and saw them nod in unison, as if approving my decision. I can't explain it, but I felt like I'd been given a glimpse of something rare and precious, a freedom so complete that it no longer needs to announce itself to the world, that exists parallel to, but untouched by the society that once tried to crush it." The story of the twins who escaped the cotton fields and became the guardians of a hidden world reminds us that not all resistance is recorded in history books, that some victories remain intentionally obscured, and that the most profound freedom might be the freedom to disappear from the gaze of those who once claimed ownership, to create a world where the oppressor becomes the unwelcome intruder, where boundaries are enforced not by law, but by something more primal and enduring, the human spirit's capacity to transform a place of exile into a homeland worth protecting for generations. As for the twins themselves, whether they were extraordinary men who created something remarkable in the heart of the Congaree, or whether their legend has grown to encompass the collective resistance of many who sought freedom in the swamp's embrace, their legacy continues to echo through the cypress trees and still waters. They stand as a reminder that sometimes the most effective resistance is not confrontation, but creation. The building of something new and unexpected in a place where others see only wilderness. And perhaps, as twilight falls over the Congaree and the ancient cypress cast long shadows across the water, they still stand watch, guardians of a freedom hard-won and fiercely protected, their silhouettes visible for just a moment before disappearing once again into the world they made their own.